But at the end of the day, does this put us any closer to a deal?
I mean, I definitely think that there are concerns about the president keeping to pressure, particularly when it comes to issues with tariffs. The Heritage Foundation for a long time has strongly recommended that the Trump administration avoid instituting additional tariffs because at the end of the day, tariffs are taxes on the American consumer, and we're already starting to feel those tariffs as they come into effect.
These tariffs, as they stand, would have gone into effect prior to the meeting between the U.S. and Chinese officials in September. They're still going into effect, although in a much smaller capacity, we can argue. Does that offer potentially a window here for the two sides to at least maybe play nice, sit down and say, maybe there are some concessions that we can both look at?
I mean, I think that at the end of the day, the goal is to restore that freedom of trade that's there. Of course, we want to be strong in our condemnations of China continuing to violate U.S. law, particularly when it violates intellectual property and uses economically coercive tactics. But I think at the end of the day, we really do want to try and restore free trade and really return to economic freedom. And I think that that leads to yet another concern. The president, as he's looked at these future trade negotiations with China, has oftentimes refrained from criticizing China on other grounds, for example, on human rights issues or the Hong Kong protests that are going on. The president and the administration has been far less supportive than they otherwise should have been for those peaceful elements of the Hong Kong protests, and has also really stopped short when it's come to condemning China for its severe human rights violations. And I think that regardless of our objectives in trade negotiations with China, we shouldn't be laying aside what has been a staple in American foreign policy, which is to promote freedom across the globe and to call out bad actors when they need to be.
Olivia, I want to get more into the Hong Kong issue, but very quickly, on the decision today for the USTR to pull back on some of the tariffs, what does this suggest in terms of the decision for the Commerce Department as we look to August 19th and potential extension of waivers for Huawei? I mean, this administration has had many discussions with some of these big tech companies like Qualcomm, like Micron, who would be severely affected by this. Does this suggest that maybe the administration is considering potential options on that front, too?
I think that's definitely possible. I mean, I think that we would welcome any attempts to roll back those tariffs. I think we also want to press China where we can on issues that are important to ensuring that American businessmen and women can operate freely in their environment. And so I think that's something that's incredibly important going forward. I think it remains to be seen in terms of this latest USTR decision, what that means for the overall trade negotiations with China.
Let's talk about what's playing out in Hong Kong right now. We did hear from the president today, as well as administration officials yesterday, say that they're looking for, they see this as an issue between Hong Kong and China. In other words, the U.S. isn't looking to interject itself in this debate. But given how this has escalated over the last 10 weeks, is it time for Washington to maybe step in to try and mediate, or is there anything you think that Washington can do?
The U.S. has a long-standing policy of being an advocate for freedom all across the globe. And in the situation with Hong Kong, it should be no different. The U.S. should be actively advocating for freedom there and supportive of the peaceful elements of the protest, while at the same time being very direct when it comes to calling out China. We've been hearing very concerning ideas that China is already engaging in some sort of exercises that would prepare for quelling or quashing those ongoing protests in Hong Kong. And the U.S. should be unequivocal in saying that China must refrain from violence and protesters must refrain from violence. Because at the end of the day, it is the Hong Kong authorities' responsibility to respond to the Hong Kongers' demands for freedom and demands for reform. And we need to start seeing that take place in order for these protests to be able to draw down.
And we should point out the video you're looking at there is from state media in China showing the PLA, the military there, inching closer to the Hong Kong mainland China border. At least this is the video that they released. Let me ask you in terms of what this could mean, though, from the U.S. China trade discussions. I know they're not necessarily linked right now. We haven't seen the White House take a very strong stance in terms of calling out the mainland Chinese government and the alleged brutality that has been happening at some of these demonstrations in Hong Kong. If the White House decides to take a stronger stance on that front, how does that change the calculation in terms of the trade talks?
Well, you heard really concerning statements, both from the White House issuing guidance to other State Department officials not to raise any support for Hong Kong. And you had the president actually saying that himself. These are extraordinarily concerning because when it comes to these trade negotiations, regardless of the objectives that we have on the trade front, human rights issues have to continue to be raised because China's human rights track record is egregious. What we're seeing today is not only what's taking place in Hong Kong, but between 1 and 3 million Uyghur Muslims are currently being held in China in political re-education facilities. The human rights situation there is extraordinarily reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. And we don't want to have another Tiananmen Square on our hands when it comes to these Hong Kong protests. So the U.S. should be strident and bold in its calls on China to not intervene in a way that would harm the Hong Kong people. And the U.S. needs to take a strong stance, one that gives greater freedom, greater space for civil society in Hong Kong to express their disgruntlement with the Hong Kong authorities.
Okay, Olivia, we're going to have to leave it there. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.